What happened in court that made everybody facepalm? My 67-year-old neighbor, Mrs. Preston, clutches her purse like her life depends on it. This fitness influencer from our building is actually suing her for baking cookies. I'm not even kidding. The guy's name is Steven, and he's wearing a tank top that says, "Discipline over donuts" to his own court hearing. This whole thing started 3 months ago when Steven moved into apartment 4B right next to Mrs. Preston. The first week was fine, but then Mrs. Preston started her daily baking routine again. Every morning at 10 a.m., sharp she'd start making these incredible chocolate chip cookies. The smell would drift through the hallway and under everyone's doors. Most of us loved it, because it made the whole floor smell like home, instead of that weird carpet cleaner smell. Steven was different, though. He knocked on her door the second week holding a protein shake and told her the cookie smell was ruining his intermittent fasting schedule. Mrs. Preston just blinked at him through her thick glasses and offered him a cookie. He actually recoiled like she was holding a snake. That should have been the end of it, but Steven started documenting everything. He'd stand in the hallway with his phone recording himself gagging dramatically whenever she baked. He posted TikToks about living next to the sugar dealer and how her cookies were biological warfare against his six-pack abs. The escalation was ridiculous. First, he complained to the building manager, who basically laughed him out of the office. Then he started leaving printed articles about diabetes under her door. Mrs. Preston would just use them as placemats. He tried taping the gaps under his door to block the smell, but that made his apartment super stuffy. He bought 3 air purifiers and positioned them by his door like some kind of fortress. Nothing worked because you can't really stop the smell of fresh-baked cookies from traveling. The breaking point came when Steven was doing a live stream workout in his apartment. Mrs. Preston happened to be making her special double chocolate cookies that day. Right in the middle of his burpee demonstration, he stopped and started ranting about the toxic fumes invading his space. His followers thought he was joking at first, but then he went on this whole speech about how his neighbor was sabotaging his lifestyle brand. He actually said she was committing olfactory assault, which isn't even a real thing. Some of his followers started calling him crazy in the comments, and he lost like 2,000 subscribers that day. That's when he decided to sue her for intentional infliction of emotional distress and interfering with his business. He was asking for $8,000 in damages, plus a restraining order that would prevent her from baking within 500 feet of him. The paperwork was insane. He had logs of every time she baked with timestamps and descriptions of how each smell affected his mental state. Tuesday's snickerdoodles caused severe psychological turmoil, apparently. In court, Steven's lawyer was this young guy who looked super uncomfortable. He kept trying to make the case sound serious, but you could tell even he thought it was stupid. They presented evidence including Steven's TikTok videos where he's practically crying about cookie smells ruining his cut. They had charts showing his follower count dropping after the cookie incidents. They even brought in a fitness expert who testified that smell can trigger cravings, which can derail fitness goals. Mrs. Preston's lawyer was her grandson, Devin, who just graduated from law school. When it was their turn, Devin walked up with a cardboard box and started pulling out letters. Turns out Mrs. Preston had been baking those cookies every day for the children's cancer ward at the hospital 2 blocks away. She'd been doing it for 15 years, ever since her own grandson beat leukemia. Devin read one letter from a 7-year-old who said Mrs. Preston's cookies were the only thing he looked forward to during chemo. The entire courtroom went silent. Someone behind me whispered, "Oh no," and I saw Steven's lawyer put his head in his hands. The judge cleared his throat, and everyone in the courtroom turned to look at him. He stared directly at Steven and asked if he really wanted to continue with this case after hearing about the cancer ward. Steven's face went from pale to bright red in about 2 seconds. He looked at his lawyer, who was still holding his head in his hands, then at the silent courtroom full of people giving him the worst looks I've ever seen. Steven opened his mouth and nothing came out at first. Then he started stammering about how he still had rights as a tenant and the smell was affecting his business. His voice cracked when he mentioned losing followers, and it sounded so small and petty after what we'd just heard. The judge rubbed his temples and suggested maybe both parties should take a 15-minute recess to think about settlement options. The way he looked at Steven when he said it made it super clear what he thought Steven should do. Everyone started filing out into the hallway, and I watched Steven's lawyer grab his arm and pull him to the side near the water fountain. The lawyer was gesturing with his hands and talking fast, while Steven kept shaking his head. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but the lawyer kept pointing back at the courtroom and making these frustrated motions. Steven crossed his arms and turned away from him, but the lawyer walked around to face him again. Mrs. Preston found a bench near the elevators and sat down with Devin standing next to her. Other neighbors from our building started gathering around her and patting her shoulder or squeezing her hand. She looked so small sitting there in her best church dress, but she was actually looking at Steven with this worried expression. That was such a Mrs. Preston thing to do, worrying about the guy who was literally suing her. A woman with a microphone and a cameraman suddenly came through the main doors and started looking around. She spotted the crowd around Mrs. Preston and headed our way, but then noticed Steven and changed direction. She walked right up to him with the camera rolling and started asking about the case. Steven's lawyer stepped between them so fast, he almost knocked the microphone out of her hand. He said they had no comment and physically turned Steven away from the camera. The reporter tried to follow, but the lawyer kept blocking her while pushing Steven toward the courtroom doors. The bailiff called everyone back inside, and we all filed back to our seats. Steven looked terrible, like he hadn't slept in days and might throw up any second. His lawyer stood up and told the judge they were willing to discuss a settlement. Stephen stared at the floor and barely nodded when the judge asked if he agreed to try mediation. The judge pulled out his calendar and scheduled a session for the following week. He gave this whole speech about how both parties needed to avoid posting about the case on social media. He looked right at Stephen when he said harassment could go both ways, and that was included online behavior. Stephen sank lower in his chair, and I actually felt a tiny bit bad for him, even though he'd brought this on himself. The judge dismissed everyone, and we all stood up to leave. Outside the courthouse, the neighbors from our building formed this protective circle around Mrs. Preston as we walked to the parking lot. People were talking over each other about how ridiculous this whole thing was. Someone suggested we should start a petition to support Mrs. Preston, and everyone immediately pulled out their phones to sign it. Mrs. Preston kept saying it wasn't necessary, but people were already sharing the petition link in the building group chat. Cars were pulling out of the parking lot, and I helped Mrs. Preston into Devon's car. She thanked everyone for coming and said she just wanted to go home and rest. That evening, I was scrolling through TikTok and Stephen's original rant video about the cookies popped up on my feed. It had gone viral again, but this time all the comments were calling him heartless and cruel. People were sharing screenshots from the courtroom and adding angry emojis. I clicked on his profile and watched his follower count drop by another 1,000 while I was looking at it. The numbers just kept going down every time I refreshed the page. Comments on his other videos were filling up with people calling him out for suing an old lady who bakes for sick kids. Someone had even found the hospital's website with a photo of Mrs. Preston delivering cookies to the ward. The contrast between that photo and Stephen's tank top in court was spreading everywhere. His Instagram was getting hit too, with people leaving cookie emojis on every post. Some fitness influencers he'd collaborated with were deleting their videos with him. One guy posted that he didn't associate with people who attacked charitable grandmothers. Stephen's whole online presence was falling apart in real time, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The next morning, my phone rang at 7, and it was Mrs. Preston asking if I was awake. She sounded worried and said she'd been up all night thinking about Stephen. She told me people were sending him awful messages online, and she felt terrible about it. She actually asked if I could go check on him since he lived right down the hall from me. I couldn't believe she was worried about the guy who was suing her, but that was just how she was. I threw on some clothes and walked down to 4B where I could hear his phone going off nonstop through the door. I knocked and waited while the buzzing continued inside. Stephen opened the door looking like he hadn't slept at all, with dark circles under his eyes and his hair sticking up everywhere. His phone was lighting up with notification after notification, and he just stared at it like he didn't know what to do. He let me in, and his apartment was a mess with protein powder spilled on the counter and workout equipment pushed against the walls. Mrs. Preston's been baking for sick kids for 15 years? That's quite the detail to drop right when Stephen's case is falling apart. I wonder if Devon knew exactly what he was doing pulling out those letters at that precise moment in court. He sat down on his couch and admitted he never knew about the cancer ward cookies. He said his lawyer told him to stop looking at social media, but he couldn't help checking every few minutes. His follower count had dropped by another 3,000 overnight, and brands were canceling partnerships left and right. I told him Mrs. Preston was actually worried about him, and his face went red. He said he'd already paid his lawyer a retainer and couldn't afford to just drop the case now. While we were talking, I got a notification from our building group chat that the manager had posted something important. The notice said there would be a mediation session next week and asked everyone to stop discussing the case online. Someone had already started a GoFundMe for Mrs. Preston's legal fees, and it was at $2,000 when I checked. By lunch, it had hit 5,000 with people from all over contributing and leaving supportive messages. Stephen's phone buzzed with an email, and his face went white when he read it. His main fitness sponsor had released a public statement saying they were pausing his partnership until the lawsuit was resolved. He showed me the email, and they basically said his actions didn't align with their brand values. That partnership was probably worth more to him than any amount of followers since it paid his rent. The mediation day came, and we all showed up at this conference room in a law office downtown. Stephen and his lawyer sat on one side of this long table, while Mrs. Preston and Devon sat on the other. The mediator was this older woman, who started by saying the case seemed like a big misunderstanding that had gotten out of hand. Stephen wouldn't look at anyone, and kept his eyes on his hands folded on the table. Mrs. Preston explained that she'd been baking at 10 in the morning for 15 years straight. She said that was when the hospital volunteer came to pick up the cookies for the kids. She offered to try baking earlier, but the volunteer couldn't change their schedule because of other stops. The mediator nodded and wrote notes while Mrs. Preston talked about how important the routine was to her. Stephen's lawyer cleared his throat, and Stephen finally spoke up for the first time. His voice was quiet when he said the cookie smell triggered something from his eating disorder recovery. The whole room went silent as he explained he'd struggled with binge eating for years before becoming a fitness influencer. He said the smell made him feel out of control, and that's why he reacted so strongly. Mrs. Preston's face softened, and she reached across the table like she wanted to pat his hand. The mediator suggested some practical solutions, while everyone processed what Stephen had shared. She said Mrs. Preston could get better seals for her door, and Stephen could move his workout equipment away from the shared wall. Both of them nodded, and seemed willing to try anything that might help. Devon leaned forward and proposed something that surprised everyone. He suggested Stephen could volunteer at the hospital to see where the cookies actually went. He said it might help Stephen understand why Mrs. Preston couldn't just stop baking them. Stephen's lawyer thought about it and said it could help repair Stephen's public image too. Stephen looked uncomfortable, but eventually agreed to try it for a month. The mediator started drafting an agreement where Mrs. Preston would shift her baking to between 6 and 8 in the morning. Stephen would help deliver cookies to the hospital once a week as part of the deal. The lawsuit would be dropped if they both completed a full month without any issues. They went over the details and made sure everyone understood what they were agreeing to. Mrs. Preston said she could manage the earlier time if it helped Stephen feel better. Stephen said he'd set his workout schedule around the new baking times. The mediator typed everything up and printed copies for everyone to review. Both lawyers read through the agreement carefully and suggested a few small changes. After about an hour of back and forth, they had something everyone could accept. Stephen and Mrs. Preston both signed the papers while the mediator witnessed it. Everyone stood up, and there was this awkward moment where nobody knew what to say. Mrs. Preston walked over to Stephen and told him she was proud of him for sharing about his recovery. Stephen's eyes got watery, and he just nodded without saying anything back. We all left the office, and I walked with Mrs. Preston to the elevator. She said she hoped this would work out for everyone involved. I could tell she really meant it too. 2 days later, the health department showed up at Mrs. Preston's door with clipboards and serious faces. Someone had made an anonymous complaint about unlicensed food preparation, and they needed to inspect her kitchen immediately. Mrs. Preston let them in without any fuss and watched them check every corner of her tiny kitchen. They tested surfaces with these little swab things and took photos of her oven and refrigerator. The inspector kept nodding and writing notes while Mrs. Preston stood there wringing her hands. After 40 minutes, they told her everything was perfectly clean, but suggested she get a food handling certification just to be safe since she was making food for the hospital. She signed up for the class that same afternoon, and when word got around the building, 12 neighbors volunteered to take it with her so they could help with the baking. The class was at the community center the following Saturday, and I went along to support her. We all sat at these long tables with workbooks about proper food temperatures and cross-contamination. Stephen walked in 15 minutes late wearing gym clothes, and everyone just stared at him. He found an empty seat in the back and kept his head down, taking notes the whole time. The instructor showed us videos about hand washing and proper storage, while Mrs. Preston answered every question correctly. When we took the test at the end, she finished first and scored 98%. Stephen passed too, though he left right after without talking to anyone. The first official delivery day under the new agreement arrived on Wednesday morning, and Stephen showed up at Mrs. Preston's door at 7:30, looking nervous. He helped her load 6 boxes of cookies into his car, while she explained which flavors the kids liked best. At the hospital, a nurse met them at the entrance and practically jumped with excitement when she saw the boxes. She kept thanking Stephen and explaining how the kids had been asking about the cookies all week since they'd missed the regular delivery during the court stuff. Stephen carried the boxes up to the pediatric ward, where kids were already waiting in the common room. A little girl in a wheelchair rolled right up to him and asked if he was the cookie man's helper. When he nodded, she wrapped her arms around his leg and told him the cookies made the medicine taste less bad. Stephen's face turned red, and he had to look away while the nurse distributed cookies to all the kids. On the drive back, he didn't say much, but Mrs. Preston patted his arm and said he did good. That night, Stephen posted a video to his Instagram, apologizing for recent drama without getting into specifics. He talked about learning to see different perspectives and announced he was starting monthly donations to the Children's Hospital. The comment section exploded with people saying they respected him for admitting he was wrong. His follower count jumped by 3,000 in 2 days as people shared his apology video. Some fitness influencers called him out for promoting sugar to kids, but most of the comments defended him, saying charity work was more important than perfect macros. Mrs. Preston started her new 6 a.m. baking schedule the next Monday, and the smell was definitely less noticeable that early. Most people were still asleep, so the hallway stayed pretty quiet while she worked. Stephen told me later that week it was actually easier to ignore during his morning meditation since his brain wasn't fully awake yet. He'd moved his workout equipment to the far wall of his apartment, and the distance helped too. 3 weeks into the new arrangement, Stephen knocked on Mrs. Preston's door with a folder full of recipes he'd printed out. He suggested adding protein cookies to the rotation for kids with different dietary needs or diabetes. Mrs. Preston loved the idea immediately, and they spent 2 hours in her kitchen testing different recipes with almond flour and protein powder. The first batch tasted terrible, but they kept adjusting until they had something that actually worked. Stephen posted videos of them baking together, and his fitness followers went crazy seeing him in an apron covered in flour. The building residents decided to organize a bake sale fundraiser for the hospital after seeing how well Stephen and Mrs. Preston were getting along. We set up tables in the lobby on a Saturday, and Stephen promoted it on all his social media channels. He did push-ups for donations, and people could pay to pick the next exercise. Someone paid $50 to make him do burpees for 5 minutes straight. By the end of the day, we'd raised over $2,000, and Stephen's abs were sore from all the demonstrations. A local news station heard about the resolution and wanted to do a follow-up story on how everything worked out. They interviewed Stephen and Mrs. Preston together in the building's courtyard, with cookies visible on a table between them. When the reporter asked Mrs. Preston what she thought of Stephen now, she called him a dear boy and said he had a good heart under all those muscles. Stephen's eyes got watery, and he had to pause before answering his question about what he'd learned from the whole experience. The interview wrapped up pretty quick after that, and Stephen's phone started buzzing nonstop in his pocket. He pulled it out and his eyes got wide as he scrolled through messages. Sweet irony when the health department basically gave Mrs. Preston's kitchen a gold star while someone was clearly trying to shut her down through the back door. His sponsor from that protein powder company had seen the news clip already and wanted to talk. They met him at a coffee shop the next day, and the rep actually seemed excited instead of mad. She said they wanted to shift his content toward balanced living instead of just extreme fitness stuff, and if he could show community involvement alongside his workouts, they'd reinstate his partnership immediately. Steven signed the new contract right there and started planning content that mixed his gym sessions with the cookie deliveries. The following Wednesday, more neighbors showed up wanting to help with the hospital run. First, it was just the older couple from 2A, but then 3 college kids from the 3rd floor joined, and even the grumpy guy from 5C came down carrying a box. Steven started making a schedule on his phone to coordinate who would go when. Within 2 weeks, we had 15 people signed up for regular shifts. Steven went to this custom t-shirt place downtown and ordered matching shirts that said Cookie Crew, with a little cookie doing a bicep curl. He paid for all of them himself and handed them out at the next building meeting. Everyone wore them to the hospital, and the kids absolutely loved seeing this whole group show up together. Mrs. Preston mentioned she'd been getting messages from Steven's followers asking for her recipe after they kept seeing her in his videos. Steven suggested doing a live stream where she could teach everyone how to make them properly. They set up in her kitchen with Steven's phone on a tripod, and Mrs. Preston walked through every step while Steven asked questions his followers had sent in. She showed how to cream the butter just right and explained why you should never overmix the dough. The stream hit 500,000 views in 3 hours, and people started sharing their own stories about baking with their grandparents. Steven's follower count jumped by 20,000 that week, and sponsors started reaching out about family-friendly content opportunities. The month trial period from the mediation agreement ended on a Thursday, and neither side had any complaints to report. The mediator called both parties to confirm everything was resolved and officially closed the case. Each side paid their own legal fees, which meant Steven was out about $3,000, but he said it was worth it for the lesson learned. Mrs. Preston never even mentioned the money she'd spent on Devin's time, though he did the work for free anyway. Around this time, Steven started spending extra time at the hospital, helping set up for the weekly cookie distribution. One of the pediatric nurses always made sure to be there when he arrived, and they'd chat while arranging cookies on plates. Her name was something with an M, and she'd tease him about the lawsuit, but you could tell she thought it was kind of sweet, how much he'd changed. After a few weeks, Steven finally asked her to dinner, and she said yes immediately. They went to this Italian place downtown, and she spent half the meal laughing at his stories about learning to bake with Mrs. Preston. She moved in with him about 4 months later and joined the morning baking sessions whenever her shift schedule allowed. Meanwhile, Devin started getting calls from law firms that had heard about how he handled his grandmother's case. 3 different firms wanted to interview him, and one partner specifically said they were impressed by his creative approach to mediation. Devin picked a smaller firm that focused on community mediation and conflict resolution instead of the big corporate place that offered more money. He said the cookie case taught him that helping people work things out was more satisfying than winning in court. The building manager decided to update the community guidelines after seeing how badly things had escalated between Steven and Mrs. Preston. She posted new rules in the lobby about dealing with cooking smells and neighbor disputes that basically said everyone needed to try talking to each other before filing any complaints. The rules specifically mentioned that cooking and baking were normal apartment activities that everyone had to tolerate within reason. She also started a monthly building meeting where people could bring up issues before they turned into lawsuits. 6 months after everything settled, Steven had a big fitness competition coming up, and he asked Mrs. Preston to be his guest. She showed up wearing one of his tank tops over her regular dress and cheered louder than anyone when he came on stage. Someone took a photo of them together afterward, with Steven holding his trophy and Mrs. Preston holding a container of cookies she'd brought for him. The photo went viral in the best possible way, with thousands of comments about how wholesome their friendship was. The hospital administrators had been watching Steven's work with the cookie program and offered to create an official volunteer coordinator position for him. They'd pay him a small stipend to organize food donations from local businesses and manage the distribution schedule. Steven used his platform to get 3 bakeries and 2 restaurants involved in regular donations to the pediatric ward. He made videos featuring each business, which helped them get new customers while supporting the kids. Mrs. Preston's baking operation had gotten so organized with all the help that she started making enough cookies for 2 additional hospitals in nearby neighborhoods. Steven helped her file paperwork to set up a proper nonprofit organization so people could make tax-deductible donations to cover ingredient costs. They called it Cookies for Courage, and within a month they had enough donations to cover supplies for the rest of the year. The mayor's office called our building manager 3 weeks later about some community service award they wanted to give us. The manager knocked on Mrs. Preston's door first, and then Steven's to tell them they'd both been nominated by someone at the hospital. They had to go downtown to City Hall on a Tuesday afternoon for the ceremony. Steven wore an actual suit instead of his usual tank top, and Mrs. Preston put on her church dress with the little flowers on it. The whole 4th floor went to support them, and we filled up 2 rows in the council chambers. When they called their names, Steven helped Mrs. Preston up the steps to the podium, and the mayor made this speech about how their story showed what community really meant. Stephen whispered something to Mrs. Preston that made her laugh right as the photographer took the official picture. You could see they were actually friends now, which was wild considering where this all started. About a month after that, Devin got invited to speak at his old law school about the case. The professor teaching alternative dispute resolution wanted real examples of creative mediation solutions. Devin brought 3 boxes of Mrs. Preston's cookies for the 100 students in the lecture hall. He walked them through how the case went from a ridiculous lawsuit to a community program that now involved dozens of volunteers. The students asked tons of questions about how he got Stephen to see past his own ego. Devin explained, it wasn't really him, but those letters from the sick kids that changed everything. One student recorded part of the lecture and posted it online where it got shared thousands of times. The law school even added it to their official case study database. Stephen's lease came up for renewal right before the 1-year anniversary of the lawsuit. Instead of leaving like everyone expected, he asked the manager about the bigger corner unit on our floor. The apartment had been empty for months because it needed work, but Stephen specifically wanted it because it was right next to Mrs. Preston's kitchen. He paid for the repairs himself and moved in over a weekend with help from half the building. Mrs. Preston made sandwiches for everyone helping with the move. Stephen hung the community service award in his new living room, where everyone could see it. The building manager had been getting complaints from other floors about cooking smells, now that more people were baking for the hospitals. Stephen proposed converting the old storage room in the basement into a proper baking center. He got his fitness sponsor interested by explaining how it would show the brand supporting community health in different ways. The sponsor agreed to fund the whole renovation, including special ventilation that would keep smells contained. The contractor installed commercial ovens and cooling racks, and those big metal tables real bakeries use. They even put in a dishwasher and storage shelves for ingredients. The renovation took 6 weeks, and Stephen documented the whole process on his social media. His followers loved seeing him actually doing construction work instead of just flexing in the gym. I started noticing Mrs. Preston moving slower around February. She'd pause at the top of the stairs to catch her breath, and her hands shook a little when she carried heavy mixing bowls. Stephen noticed too because he started showing up at 5:30 in the morning without anyone asking. He'd handle all the heavy lifting and mixing while she supervised and added ingredients. They developed this whole routine where she'd sit on a stool directing while he did the physical work. Neither of them ever talked about why he was really there that early. The other volunteers just accepted it as part of the schedule now. The city contacted us about expanding the cookie program to help teenagers aging out of foster care. They wanted to create job training where kids could learn baking skills and food safety certification. Stephen immediately volunteered to teach nutrition classes, while Mrs. Preston would handle the actual baking instruction. The first group had 6 teenagers who showed up looking skeptical about the whole thing. Within a week, they were competing to see who could make the most perfect chocolate chip cookies. The way Mrs. Preston taught those foster teens to bake makes me wonder if she ever had kids of her own who she passed recipes to. How did Stephen know exactly when to show up at 5:30 without being asked? Stephen taught them about protein and carbs without making it sound like a lecture. Mrs. Preston shared life advice while they measured flour and sugar. 2 of those kids ended up getting jobs at real bakeries using the references from the program. A documentary filmmaker reached out through the hospital about telling their story. She'd heard about the lawsuit and the cookie program and thought it would make a great short film. Stephen and Mrs. Preston agreed to participate, but only if all the proceeds went to the children's hospital. They also insisted filming had to work around the actual baking schedule, not the other way around. The filmmaker followed them for 3 months, getting footage of early morning baking sessions and hospital deliveries. She interviewed the kids getting treatment and their parents about what the cookies meant to them. The final documentary was 28 minutes long and premiered at a local film festival. It won the Audience Choice Award and later got picked up by a streaming service. Stephen's girlfriend had been joining the morning baking sessions whenever her nursing shifts allowed. Mrs. Preston really liked her and started teaching her family recipes she'd never written down anywhere. They'd spend hours going over the exact amount of vanilla or how to tell when butter was the right temperature. The girlfriend kept a notebook where she wrote everything down with little drawings of Mrs. Preston's hand movements. Stephen would watch them working together with this soft expression on his face. Mrs. Preston started calling the girlfriend her bonus granddaughter, which made everyone tear up a little. Word spread about our building and the cookie program until reporters started calling us the cookie building in news stories. The building manager said she was getting calls from people specifically asking about apartments because they wanted to join the volunteer program. Property values in our neighborhood actually went up, and the realtor down the street said our building was becoming a selling point for the area. New tenants would knock on Mrs. Preston's door their first week, asking how they could help with baking. The volunteer schedule had so many names now we had to create shifts. Some people baked, others did delivery, and some handled the ingredient shopping and organizing. Mrs. Preston turned 69 that spring, and Stephen spent weeks planning her birthday party. He coordinated with the building manager to reserve the courtyard and got donations from local businesses for food and decorations. He made sure every single person who'd ever volunteered with the cookie program got an invitation. The morning of her birthday, he hung a massive banner that said, "Happy birthday to our cookie queen," across the building entrance. When Mrs. Preston came outside that afternoon, she found over 200 people waiting to celebrate her. There were tables full of food and a cake so big it took 4 people to carry it. Stephen got up on a chair to give a speech about how Mrs. Preston had changed his whole perspective on what success really meant. He talked about going from suing her to considering her family and how her kindness had taught him more than any fitness program ever could. Mrs. Preston was crying by the end, and so was pretty much everyone else, including me. The hospital board president showed up at the party with this huge framed certificate announcing they were naming the new pediatric playroom the Mrs. Preston Cookie Crew Room. Stephen grabbed the microphone and promised right there to do a 24-hour fitness marathon to raise money for all the equipment the room would need. He set it up for the next month and got local businesses to pledge donations for every mile he ran on the treadmill. The marathon happened on a Saturday, and our whole building basically moved into the gym to cheer him on. Mrs. Preston sat in a chair by his treadmill the entire time, feeding him protein bars and water while people donated through his live stream. He raised $32,000 and could barely walk for 3 days after, but kept saying it was worth it. Time passed fast after that, with the cookie program running smooth as clockwork every week. Stephen started talking about opening his own place that would make healthy treats and give jobs to people getting clean from drugs. He spent 2 years planning everything and getting investors while still helping Mrs. Preston every morning. The bakery opened 3 years after the lawsuit, with Mrs. Preston cutting the ribbon, while Stephen's girlfriend took pictures. Half the employees were people from recovery programs, and Stephen made sure they all got health insurance and flexible schedules for their meetings. The place sold protein cookies and sugar-free muffins, but also regular treats because Stephen said balance was more important than perfection. Every month they'd donate half their profits to the children's hospital, which meant some months Stephen barely broke even, but he didn't care. Mrs. Preston turned 72 that year and told us she was getting too tired for daily baking. Stephen organized this whole training program where she'd teach groups of volunteers her recipes and techniques over 6 weeks. People signed up so fast we had to create a waiting list for the next session. She'd sit on a stool directing, while the volunteers did the mixing and measuring under her watch. Stephen worked with lawyers to set up this fund that would pay for ingredients and supplies forever, even after we were all gone. He put in $50,000 of his own money and got matching donations from his fitness sponsors who loved the whole redemption story. The program got so organized that volunteers could sign up online for shifts, and the hospital knew exactly when cookies would arrive each day. Mrs. Preston still came down most mornings just to check on things and give advice, but she didn't have to do the heavy work anymore. Looking back at everything now from my new apartment across town, I realized that stupid lawsuit changed everything for the better. Stephen went from this shallow guy obsessed with his abs to someone who actually made a difference in people's lives. Mrs. Preston got the help she needed to keep her cookie mission going without killing herself doing it alone. Those kids at the hospital still get fresh cookies every single week, just like they have for 20 years now. Thanks for letting me wonder. Alongside you through all of this today, it's definitely been interesting sharing these moments together. Take care. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.